Well, hello, I want to thank you all for signing in today. We're going to get right into the presentation, and I know that you see HCC next to diagnosis codes in all scripts and may wonder why that's important, and that's what we're going to look at today. Talking about a risk score and why this is important, Medicare calculates a risk score for each of our patients, and that determines how much money Medicare decides that patient needs for you to take care of that patient for the following year. So how you've coded and how you've assessed their problems over the previous year determines their risk score and how much money will be allotted to take care of that patient. And you can see how that is very important and will be becoming more and more important in our Medicare shared savings programs. So we're going to talk about how these risk scores are developed. So when you look at a risk score and the HCC codes, which are hierarchical condition categories, this is a risk model that provides an algorithm for assessing a patient's risk of future medical costs. For each patient, an algorithm computes a risk adjustment factor score or risk score, which is based on a risk model. The risk adjustment factor is a numeric measure of how at risk a patient is. So the higher the risk score, the more at risk the patient is. Now Medicare assigns an average patient an average risk at 1. So if a patient has a risk score less than 1, that is saying that patient is healthier than the average Medicare patient. If the risk adjustment factor is greater than 1, that is saying that that patient is sicker than the average Medicare patient. The risk model has tables of demographics, disease groups, and interactions, and that assigns an associated risk adjustment score to that patient. So we asked, how did they get this score? What makes up the risk adjustment factor or risk score? You have the total risk score, which is a demographic risk adjustment factor added to a disease risk adjustment factor. The demographic risk adjustment factor is determined by the patient's age and gender. So, of course, we have no control over that part of the risk score. The disease risk adjustment factor is a measure of the disease conditions that the patient has been diagnosed with. So you have a group RAF or group risk score and interaction risk score. Each HCC disease group represents a disease or family of diseases. For example, if a patient has diabetes, that is a disease family. So a patient could have diabetes with 3 complications, but they would only get 1 score per disease group family. However, if a patient has diabetes with complications, if that is coded versus a patient versus coding diabetes without complication, you can see that the score is greater. So the disease risk adjustment factor sums all the disease groups to which that patient belongs. So if a patient has diabetes, they get a score for diabetes, whether that's with or without complication. Then if they have congestive heart failure, they would get points added on for that. COPD, points added on for that. That is the group risk adjustment factor. Then there is an interaction risk adjusted factor, which is a type of bonus factor applied if a patient has 2 or more conditions that negatively impact each other. And I will show you these in just a minute. This is a table of the demographic risk adjustment factor based on the patient's gender and age. So this is a constant given based on that information. And that is added to the disease RAF or risk adjustment factor. Now this is a table that we've created, and you will all get a copy of this. This is divided up into different disease families and their associated risk score. So don't get too bogged down in this HCC group number on the left. That's just showing you the different group categories. The main takeaway point is that the disease processes listed here are the disease processes associated with an HCC code, a hierarchical condition category code, which carries risk. You can again see that your diabetes with complications carries more risk than without. Diabetic retinopathy has a code of risk. Morbid obesity. So each of these disease categories has multiple ICD-10 codes under it, but we're just giving you the broad categories and the associated risk. So if you were going to calculate a risk adjustment factor, you would get your points from your demographics that we showed here, and then you would get points for each disease family. Taking the same example, diabetes with complication, we would add 0.368. If that patient also had congestive heart failure, we would add a 0.368. COPD, 0.346. And then if you go to the very bottom on the right, the disease interaction combination, these were the bonus factor points that I mentioned. So if a patient had diabetes and congestive heart failure, they would get an added score of 0.182. We do not calculate these scores. That is calculated by Medicare, but this is a guideline to go by to see how Medicare is determining risk for our patients. Does anyone have any questions on this?
This is Sarah. One of the things that I would like to just remind everyone of, we've talked about the HCC indicators in Allscripts. When you're looking at your problem list or searching for diagnoses in the HCI, your diagnoses as it's spelled out, you'll have a little HCC indicator to the left of that if it is a HCC code. And these codes come straight from the Medicare algorithm. They're loaded into Allscripts. When you look at those HCC indicators, if that HCC is in red lettering, that means that diagnosis has not been coded or captured this year if it's on your problem list. If it has been coded and captured this year, it will be green with a little gray check through it. So when we're talking about coding and capturing these, it's January 1 to December 31 is when we're trying to make sure that we are coding all of these within the calendar year for Medicare. The other thing I want to point out here when you're looking at the group is just reiterate what Dr. Swaim said about the disease groups. So there are several diabetes codes with complications. We did not list all of those out because they all fall under the same disease group and have the same risk score. Some of these do have multiple diagnoses listed next to the HCC group, and those Dr. Swaim listed out we thought might be ones that people would have questions about. So if you have a question about a specific diagnosis and whether it would be included, you can send those to us directly and we can give you more information.
So there might be some questions about, for instance, congestive heart failure, whether that's systolic or diastolic or controlled or uncontrolled. And according to this algorithm, a patient would get the same risk score with any diagnosis of congestive heart failure. The same thing for other diagnoses. Some of the things that were interesting to me that were things that we need to make sure that we're capturing are diagnosis that we may not think about capturing. So if a person has had an amputation or if a person has a PEG tube, within the calendar year, those codes need to be coded in order to capture that risk. If a patient has protein calorie malnutrition or morbid obesity, those carry risks. Those are things that we need to make sure that we're assessing within the calendar year. And use those tools in Allscripts, your dashboard and your tools, to be sure that those codes are being captured within the calendar year.
And when you look at the CQS dashboard for the patient, at the very bottom of that, for any Medicare Advantage patient, HealthSpring, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Medicare Advantage, it's going to give you that HCC recapture section. So when you see RAF, that's the risk adjustment factor Dr. Swaim's mentioned, and that's the equivalent of saying risk score. We use those words interchangeably. But it'll list a RAF, and it'll list a RAF gap. And that gap will be listed in red, and you can see which diagnoses those are, but it's telling you that's the amount of score that we have not picked up this year. So it's trying to help you recapture these diagnoses for this calendar year if they're still appropriate for your patient. Okay, if we don't have any other questions, if you find any diagnoses that you have a specific question about that you can't find the answer for by looking at the sheet, then please contact us directly, and we will get all these out in the mail to each of you this afternoon. Thanks to everyone for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.